Hello, everybody. Good afternoon or evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Thank you to everybody who's taken the time to attend today, whether in person or online. I'm Derek Ambrosino. I work in the comms department at TB Alliance. As some of you may know, this year is TB Alliance's 25th anniversary. And while it's a bit cliche to say, you can learn a lot about the future by looking to the past. TB Alliance has been a leader in TB research for the last quarter century. And in so doing, it's learned that TB is a resilient and tricky bug, and that to advance the fight against TB, you often have to implement atypical approaches. And that doesn't just mean scientifically. But here at TB Alliance, we weren't the first to learn that lesson. Our featured speaker today is Maria Smilios, author of the book, The Black Angels, a book which several of you will have a chance to win later on if you're in the room today. The Black Angels tells a story of a group of Black nurses who at Seaview Hospital, an hour or so away over in Staten Island, played an integral role in the discovery of isoniazid, one of the most important developments in the history of TB, and one of the 4 drugs that to this day comprise drug-sensitive TB treatment. Maria stumbled upon this fact while editing a book on rare lung diseases in a previous job, and was most extremely interested to learn more about this story, and then I think a bit frustrated about how little information there was in the world about it. So she did what any curious, overachieving self-starter would. She got to digging deep and wrote her own dang book. And in so doing, she developed relationships with some of the last living individuals who were able to recount these stories firsthand. These stories are at the nexus of health, social movements, larger political dynamics, and struggles for resources. They were filled with unsung heroes, creative solutions, and the resiliency of the human spirit, all phenomena that are very familiar to those of us who continue to work in this field this day. Through writing this book, Maria learned more about the history of TB and TB research, and as her knowledge grew, so did her passion and resolve to participate in the global TB response and mobilize others to do so as well. TB Alliance and Maria joined forces around the Fast Track to Cure initiative, a community-led program that brings affected communities and civil society groups together from around the world to raise awareness and advocate for universal access to short, safe, and effective cures for TB, specifically right now for drug-resistant TB. Fast Track to Cure leverages grassroots and digital advocacy tactics, and our own Robin Waite, quite the curious overachieving self-starter in her own right, slid in Maria's DMs and struck up a convo, leading to an initial collaboration on social media, which has since for several other collaborative opportunities. So we also owe this relationship and this event today very much to Robin. And speaking about the event, I'm sure you're eager to get started. So just as a bit of a primer, you'll hear first from Maria about the stories of the Black Angels and the discovery of isoniazid. Then we'll take a bit of a Q&A with Maria. For those of you online, feel free to use the submit a question feature on the Zoom, and you can submit questions. That way we'll read them aloud in the room. And then finally, we'll hear a bit from TB Alliance President and CEO Mel Spiegelman, a bit on the parallels of TB research in the past and present, and a little bit about what TB Alliance has in store for the future of TB research. So without further ado, let's get the show on the road, and I'm going to turn it over to Maria Smilios.
Thank you, Derek, for that very colorful and lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here. Good afternoon. It's afternoon, right? Good afternoon. I just want to thank the TB Alliance and Robin and Derek and everybody who worked really hard to get me to get this event underway. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Black Angels. The Black Angels is a story about many things: health inequities, stigma, sickness, systemic and institutional racism, and working at a time when resources for tuberculosis were scarce, if there were any. But at its heart, it is a story about an exceptional group of women whose narrative, now, with the rise of anti-science, misinformation, and the desire to scrub history, and the current rise in tuberculosis cases, particularly in Kansas City, as we were talking about earlier, is as relevant now as it was 100 years ago. Those who are familiar with the story of Seaview know that on February 20th, 1952, the cure for tuberculosis was discovered there. And I say discovered because Dr. Robichek did not compound INH. That happened at Hoffman Roche, but he oversaw the first human drug trials. What many didn't know was the story behind the story, the one about the Black nurses that until last year only existed in the memories of their families. Like so many stories, theirs begins with a serendipitous moment, a twinkling in the universe where things seem to be aligning for one purpose, to bring certain people together for something world-changing. On a gray day in May 1929 in the Bronx, Arthur, a 55-year-old man, lay in his house, wheezing and wasted and wheezing. His wife and 16-year-old son sat bedside, feeling the mist from a rain that blew through the open window, bringing an earthy scent, dulling the smell of disease that for years had permeated the air. The boy moved closer to his father, the man he loved most in the world, and watched as his chest rose and fell, and the distance between each rasping breath grew and grew until finally it stopped, ending 6 years of torment from laryngeal tuberculosis, a quote, monstrous form of the disease, the boy would later say. 2 days later, this boy buried his father in Woodlawn Cemetery, and then he went home and tumbled into a grief so deep and vast and powerful that it would alter the course of his life. Eventually, this boy would become the man many of you know, Dr. Edward Robichek. As young Edward mourned his father, trying to understand his loss, 12 miles away at City Hall, the Commissioner of Health was mired in a crisis of his own. Suddenly, inexorably, the white nurses at Seaview Hospital began quitting. One by one, they hung up their uniforms and walked out. Their reasons varied. Some cited the 5-hour commute, the successive days of 12-hour shifts, the mental and physical toll their job demanded, but most were leaving to escape tuberculosis, the great white plague, the robber of youth, and its victims, the quote, infected, incurable, indigent, un-American consumptives. That's who came to Seaview, New York's largest municipal sanatorium. On its floors, hundreds of patients lay, at Seaview in 1938. On its floors, hundreds of patients lay in iron frame beds, languishing, their bodies teeming with millions of arrogant microbes that gnawed at their lungs, kidneys, and tongues, their spines and bones and brains. All day long, they sweated and groaned and cried out. They coughed and choked and spit up blood, each hack sending swarms of live germs onto bedpans and sheets, tables, chairs, and doorknobs. The bacteria landed on walls and nightstands and window shades. It drifted under beds and down hallways, slinking into every room and corner of the ward. It was always present, prowling, waiting to strike anyone who wasn't already sick. And all it took was a single inhalation. For years, the nurses had watched their colleagues fall ill. They saw how their faces turned ashen, how their eyes burned from a fever that climbed and climbed, and how their skin exuded a sickly odor that no amount of washing could eradicate. Some recovered, at least temporarily. Others died in the wards where they once worked. In those early days of 1929, before the crash, the city thrummed and churned and grew, giving white working women plenty of options for jobs that would not kill them. New York City has a rich history of tuberculosis, one that reaches back centuries. But in the early 1900s, tuberculosis really began to flourish. It came in the waves of immigrants that arrived from all over Europe and found lodging in the Lower East Side tenements. City officials like Dr. Herman Biggs despised these buildings that journalist Jacob Riis dubbed, quote, fever-breeding structures. But more so, Biggs despised the people that lived in them. For years, he had spearheaded an effort to control the spread of tuberculosis through various measures: tent colonies, disease maps, registration laws, posters, and even a health clown named Choo Choo, who, along with his health dog sidekick Primo, sang ditties about bathing, drinking milk, and opening windows to children living in the slums. That all failed, and Biggs grew desperate. He implored the city to build a hospital as a, quote, necessary protection for those who don't have tuberculosis, but are exposed to it by the carelessness of others. The city obliged, and in 1913 opened Seaview. Within 2 days, it reached its original capacity of housing 800 sick people. By 1945, the hospital would house 1,800 people. It was only built to house about 1,550. Now, at the end of the By 1920, Seaview had helped the annual death rate in New York drop by almost half, from 10,000 to a little more than 5,000. But now, at the end of the 1920s, the nurses were leaving the dream hospital, and Seaview's triumph had become Commissioner Wynn's nightmare. Tuberculosis remained the third leading killer in the great metropolis, and the fourth globally. Sending patients to other hospitals was impossible. They were all full. If the commissioner could not find nurses to staff Seaview, he would be forced to close wards, and hundreds of highly contagious TB patients would converge on his city, their coughs and phlegm flinging active bacilli into the air like confetti. Infection rates would rise, and decades of progress would be reversed. The commissioner would not let that happen. Not on his watch, he said. Seaview would not close. Emergency meetings ensued, and an idea emerged. The city would issue a hiring call across the South, one like those made by recruiters who swayed Black sharecroppers and farmers to leave and come north and work in slaughterhouses, steel mills, and factories. Across the country, hundreds of trained Black nurses were qualified, yet un- or underemployed because of segregation. The city would offer them a package: free schooling, housing, a salary, and above all, as they saw a quote, rare opportunity to work at one of the city's integrated municipal hospitals. At the time, only 4 of New York's 29 municipal hospitals employed Black nurses. The call went out, advertisements appeared in Black newspapers and in church bulletin boards. Recruiters from New York showed up at historically Black colleges, and soon Black student nurses read about the chance for a career in New York City. I should add that these nurses believed they were going to Harlem. They had no idea they were going to Staten Island. News spread by word of mouth, moving down the eastern seaboard across the Mason-Dixon line through Virginia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and deeper into the American South. It didn't take long before the nurses began coming, packing up their lives and dreams and leaving southern cities and rural towns. Alone, they boarded those Jim Crow trains and buses and headed north. In talking to the families, I heard how these women were determined to rise above the math that said Black women can't have professional careers or own homes. How the burning desire to heed their calling of caring for those who were left to die and to live a life free from the daily constraints of segregation. The back doors, the yes sirs, the colored fountains, the waiting areas, the sidewalk rules, the violence, and whatever else white men had dreamt up and turned into law roused them. These were the yearnings that led them to the wards of a sanatorium to work with one of the deadliest diseases during one of the most dreadful times in human history, the pre-antibiotic days of the Great Depression that unfolded alongside a country entrenched in the virulency of Jim Crow. But they believed this was their ticket to freedom. During the 1930s and 40s, hundreds of women answered the call, far too many to fit into a single book. But in the short time I have, I want to give you a glimpse into one of them. The call arrived in Savannah, Georgia, one sweltering August day in 1929, 3 months into young Robichek's mourning. It came to 28-year-old Edna Sutton like a reverie, a glorious invitation that reawakened her waning dream of becoming a surgeon. Born in 1900 on the floor of a tar paper shack in one of Savannah's shanty towns, such dreams, her family said, were considered, quote, fanciful, lofty, outrageous. Black women in Savannah rarely left menial jobs in the city, let alone become surgeons. But Edna's father, an enslaved man, inspired his daughter. In 1899, he walked off his plantation in Confederate Wilkes County, Georgia, arrived in Savannah, and reinvented himself as a preacher. Dream big, he taught her. Edna's dreams reached the stars, and after high school, she enrolled in one of Savannah's 2 Black training schools for nurses, the Georgia Infirmary, a small charity hospital that relied on donations and student labor to stay open. It was considered a godforsaken place that strained to serve 1,800 impoverished people a year, a burden that fell on Edna and her fellow trainees, who assisted a small staff of overworked nurses. In addition to taking vitals, learning wound care, assisting in procedures, the nurses also mopped and cleaned bathrooms, changed bed linens, and laundered clothes. Despite all the issues, long hours, and lack of supplies, many times there weren't enough shrouds to bury the dead, Edna loved her job. In the words of her family, she had, quote, found her calling. But after 2 years of training, the school let her go, and Edna joined thousands of Black nurses who were unemployed and whose dreams were thwarted because the same country that drew lines around water fountains and bus stations also drew them around hospitals. So Edna spent years working as a clerk, taking care of her younger sister, Americus. And then one day she learned about CVU and applied because what Edna wanted most in her life was a professional career, one that would allow her to pursue her dream of medicine and make her enough money to buy a house in a place where she didn't have to look at those signs telling her where she could sit, where she could walk, where she could go to school, a place where her younger sister would have opportunities that she could only ever imagine. Seaview, she believed, was that place. For decades, she worked in appalling conditions. There were supply shortages and lack of staff. They cobbled together whatever resources they had to care for patients who asked about operations with terrifying names, thoracoplasty, lobectomy, and frenetic nerve crush. And then they tried to quell their anxiety about dying. But dying at Seaview was par for the course. And day and night, Edna and her colleagues sat with the dying and watched as tuberculosis exacted its price. It pulverized lungs and liquefied organs. Quickly, these women came to understand that few places were darker than Seaview. But until there was a better treatment for tuberculosis, this is where she was called, to this island, this hospital, and these people that the city had damned. There were many others like Edna who committed themselves to caring for the sick and destitute people of New York, Clemmy Phillips, Virginia Green, Curleen Jennings Bennett, who's one of the last living Black angels, Leola Washington, Missouri Lovino Meadows Walker, and Virginia Allen, who's the second living Black angel. She's 93 years old. Virginia was the niece of Edna, and she came in 1947 during a dire nurse shortage set off by the war. At 16 years old, with no nursing experience, she was hired as an aide in the Children's Hospital, whose hollowed out remains now stand in a jumble of dense forest. Back then, when its floors were filled with 250 children, that's Virginia, so Virginia lives in the restored nurses' residence in the Seaview complex. So she walks out her front door, and that's 500 feet from the front door when she walks out. So she's constantly looking at the place where she worked almost 80 years ago. When its floors were filled with 250 children, many said it was the saddest place in the world, a place where the disease reared itself in uglier ways, in the rows of cribs and beds, in the walkers and wheelchairs, in the children's toys that lay strewn on blankets or tossed under and around the beds. It arrived in the dissonance of noise, of sounds and screams from mommy and daddy that one nurse said were, quote, sometimes absolutely unbearable. When these women came to Seaview, no one told them that here people were sicker than anyone should be allowed that anyone should be allowed to ever become sick, that people here remain for years. I looked at hundreds of medical cards that they told the story. Length of stay, 463 days, 800 days. One read 1,019 days, 3 straight years at Seaview. For these people, time fell away and they grew desperate and depressed. Their voices laced with a dark and faded bitterness, a resignation reserved only for the gravely ill and only for places like this, where life was lived in the shadow of death. And all the while, they dealt with the institution personified by their supervisor, Miss Lorna Doone Mitchell, a Teutonic white woman, the daughter of a Confederate medic who wielded her power in perverse ways. She refused to allow nurses to wear masks on a regular basis. Masks, she said, made them complacent. According to one nurse, she had a gaze that could, quote, freeze the devil himself. Then there was the racist vision of some city officials that the nurses, like these patients, were quite simply expendable. In 1933, at a meeting with over 300 people of city officials and nurses, a young Black nurse stood up and asked the president of hospitals, Mr. President, why do you send Black nurses to Seaview? And he replied, quote, the reason we sent Black nurses to Seaview is because in 20 years, we won't have a colored problem in America because they'll all be dead from tuberculosis. But they didn't die. In the face of such impediments, they persisted, giving us the ending we all know. The one beginning on February 20th, when the New York Post prematurely broke the news about a cure, carrying the banner headline, Wonder Drug Fights TB. and in a single galvanizing moment changed the course of history. It was triumphant, and as Dr. Robichek later said, quote, "None of it would have been possible without the Black nurses." But then nobody cared about their story. If you look closely at the most iconic picture taken from that day, the photograph that we would say today went viral, the once incurables are front and center jitterbugging. In the back stand the Black nurses. Their faces staid and somber tell a different story, more complex one of women who saw terrible things, who in these buildings did the impossible, prevail over humanity's greatest scourge, tuberculosis. They did it because it was their job, because they had committed themselves to saving lives at the risk of their own, but also because they were Black women, subjects of Jim Crow's labor laws that offer them few, if any, options. I want to believe that we've moved far away from many aspects of this story, but I fear, especially now and in the coming years, we have not. There is still a lot of work to do. In graduate school, I had the privilege of studying with Dr. Elie Wiesel, an Auschwitz survivor, who talked in depth about what it meant to bear witness, what moral obligation we had as human beings when we heard or read a story or witnessed something that was unjust. His class changed me and the decision of how I wanted to live my life. When I learned about this story, I couldn't turn away from the inaccuracy of the history and the myriad injustices, many that still exist today. For instance, there are still far too many people who don't have access to affordable and accessible drugs because the same stigma and othering that only certain people are worthy of good care that existed 80 years ago during the time of the Black Angels still exists today. While ensuring that everyone has access to new breakthroughs is challenging, especially right now, it is not impossible. Together, through telling stories from the past and highlighting how they inform the present, we can ensure that those in resource-constrained environments are treated with dignity and respect and not made to needlessly suffer because of political gatekeeping. Last week, this photo was posted. It's the inside of the NIH hallways. It's the before and after. As you can see on the before side, there were these posters of women scientists and women of color, and they've been taken down. I sat for a long time looking at the photograph and thinking of the implications of removing history, especially medical history. They are far too vast to talk about right now. Of course, I couldn't help but think about the Black Angels who had been erased from history for 80 years. And because of that, there had been an entire narrative about tuberculosis and the cure that was crafted without them. Over the 10 years that I was writing the book, some people expressed sadness that they weren't part of this history. Others expressed outrage, but most people expressed gratitude that finally history would be righted. And now we stand at a moment when so much of history is in jeopardy of vanishing, including this one, because I do receive emails on a regular basis from people telling me that my woke book should be erased, and it's not true. And for some, they can believe that. But for those who don't, it's up to us to ensure that these women, this history about this disease, this terrible disease that took millions and millions of lives and continues to kill millions of people, is not erased. So if there's one thing I ask is please remember that history matters. This history matters. The history of tuberculosis matters. Actually, the history of all disease matters. And yes, the stories of the Black Angels is heartbreaking and many times infuriating, but ultimately it is a story of triumph, of humanity, one that reminds us there will always be people like these nurses and the ones who stood on the front lines during COVID, who selflessly commit themselves to working on the front lines of medicine. And mostly it's a story about women who found the will, the determination to make the world a better place, one where equity and compassion, morality and love, and bearing witness are the guiding principles. Thank you.
I think we can take some questions. I don't know if there are any, we can start, I guess, in the room and then, Jess, if you have some from online. You can
Yeah, thank
also
you.
add,
If you
but-
are speaking in the room, just make sure to project so everybody online can hear you as well.
Sure, I'll help get us started. Is this on? Yeah, I think so.
Just bring it a little closer.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the first human trial work of isoniazid unfolded at CVU Hospital and what role the Black nurses were playing and a little bit about that archival research that you did to write the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in 1951, so Seaview Hospital was a hospital that had men, women, and it was one of the few that had children, a children's hospital. It actually had a maternity ward, so people gave birth there. So you had from 0 all the way up to whatever age, 70. And it was a hospital that also had all different ethnicities and races. So, and all different types of tuberculosis. So it was a great place to be able to do trials because they could test the drugs on different types of TB. Most of the TB drugs were tested on pulmonary tuberculosis because that was the most common type. So in 1951, in May, Dr. Selikoff, who was Dr. Robachek's partner, received a call from Hoffman LaRoche that said, hey, you know this drug that we've been testing on guinea pigs and on mice, it's showing promise. Do you want to test it on humans? Yes. So in 2 days, they got the okay to go ahead from the head of the hospital, the president, Dr. Orenstein. And they put together a trial of 5 patients. There were 3 women and 2 men. These were called lungers. That's what they used to call themselves, terminal patients. They had been in and out of Seaview. And the criteria was death had to be imminent and no other, like everything else had failed. So streptomycin had failed, operations had failed. So these 5 patients were approached and said, listen, you're dying, essentially, but we have the possibility of this drug. And they agreed, they consented. And I just want to make sure of that because I know there's some information floating out there. This was a Tuskegee kind of experiment. It wasn't. He got consent from all of them. I know this because I spoke to 2 of them that had been part of this trial. So they said yes. And he set up this initial 5-person trial, having no idea how to titrate the medication. All his information had come from mice and guinea pigs. So he began to titrate it based on kilograms. And the nurses were the ones administering the medication. Now, the nurses had been working there for decades. They knew these patients, they knew the disease, they knew its nuances, how it ebbed and flowed. They knew how how wily and stealth the microbe is, how in an instant somebody can wake up in the morning and be fine and then they're hemorrhaging. And so in addition to just taking the vitals, they were tracking the patient's emotional, mental, and physical, what was going on with them when they were giving them medication. That worked. They stopped it for 6 weeks. There were no toxic side effects. And then they started up with 92 patients. And that's what became the initial trial. So they split men and women into 2 wards, and it was up to these nurses. And at the end of the day, Robachek would come, he'd collate their notes, he'd go down, he'd collect them, collate them. And that's how they started to see, oh, well, look, INH at this dosage is creating dizziness or a ringing in the ear. But it was all based on the nurse's notes. And I always say there's one moment where you can see how astute and meticulous they were. They started to notice that people's legs were twitching in their sleep. And so these people were anorexic. So, they slept under lots and lots of blankets. So imagine being able to notice that, they did, because they knew these patients and they knew what was normal for TB and what wasn't. And that is how the trials began to, that's how they started to get all this information. And, his papers, his son gave me all the archives, and you can look at, they're handwritten papers. They look like Excel spreadsheets. And he's got all the medication and how he begins to increase it or decrease it. And it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do have some questions from online, but feel free, anybody in the room, to raise your hands as well. The first question, what did you learn, if anything, about other staff at Seaview?
So I was able to, there are 2 Black angels alive. One of them has dementia. She was able to talk to me a little bit, but Virginia, who came in 1947, was able to tell me about her experience. I learned that there, in terms of a question about other doctors or nurses. Seaview was a premier hospital for doctors to kind of go and train for infectious disease and tuberculosis. They didn't really like to stay there. It was far. People got sick. So they usually had posts in the city and would spend a day at Seaview. It was a premier hospital considered a premier hospital for operations. I think they performed by 1938, 35,000 artificial pneumothoraxes. And I talk a little bit about that in the book, that there were patients that were, quote, refilled about 100 times. Because it only lasted for 10 days. They'd put the air in and then it would like fizzle out. So I don't, do they want to know about like cooks and people who work there?
You just said other staff, so whatever, if you learned anything.
I mean, yeah, there were lots of other people, like support staff that made it work, but, you know, I didn't, for my purposes, I wasn't actively seeking out the other staff.
Any questions over there? Okay, we have another one
So-
online.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Todd, go ahead.
There are a number of other sanitariums around. I know New Jersey had one. Did you say, is this completely unique, you think, to Seaview, or do you think all the sanitariums had similar types of experiences?
So I think from what the research that I did, and I didn't do deep dives into other sanatoriums, the reason being that I was like mired in trying to get this story done. But the protocols across the country were pretty much on par. Everybody was doing pneumothoraxes, everybody was doing thoracoplasties. You know, all of that was on par. I think where Seaview differed was, first of all, it was in New York City, and to have a hospital that size in New York, which is why they built it in Staten Island, was a very big deal, right? Like to run a municipal hospital of 1,800 people, taking care of 1,800 patients. The children's hospital was huge, it's 250 people. And then they had this cutting edge maternity ward. So from that aspect, that was unique. It was rare that you had a children's hospital on the same grounds as you had patients, adult patients. And it was even rarer to have a maternity clinic. But for the most part, most of the sanatoriums were, you know, very regimented, the same thing. You wake up at this time, you know, the patients told me like, it was military, you know, you got up at this time, you had to be quiet at this time. That sanatorium regime was probably across the globe.
Right, so another one from online. How aware do you think the nurses were that they were not only treating and caring for people with TB, but also participating in the testing of a new cure?
So they knew they were treating people with tuberculosis. I mean, they knew it when they got the job. Virginia, when you talk to her, she was 16 years old. You know, she came in 1947. She's like, it was like babies treating babies, right? She wanted a paycheck. She came up here from Detroit. She wanted this opportunity to be a nurse. She says herself, I did not realize like how grave the situation was. The nurses knew. And they had known, like in Savannah, there was a big TB outbreak before, like in the earlier years. So they were treating tuberculosis a lot in these hospitals where they had worked. What was the second part of the question?
But that they were testing a new cure.
They knew that. The nurses who were involved in the trials knew what they were doing. There was nothing hidden from them. This wasn't anything like, just give this medication. They didn't know the name of the medication. They knew that they were doing this trial, that they had to administer the medication, and that they had to take down all of these notes. So they were aware, as were the patients. However, the rest of the hospital wasn't. They tried to keep it and quarantined it, and then it started to come out. You know, like, wait, there's people who are being cured up there. Like, you know, Hilda was dying, but now she's walking around. So it started to leak out. Because you know how, I mean, it was just up like on the 5th floor. So the people on the 4th floor were like, wait a second, what's happening now? This person's wandering around. Yeah.
So that picture that you showed of the newspaper article or the front page that said like, miracle drug or
Wonder
drug.
drug, yeah.
Yeah, wonder drug. Were they only treating, TB with isoniazid alone? And do you know how long they were treating, or would they do combinations with like streptomycin or
No.
anything else?
That trial was just INH. And that was the whole thing. It was just this one particular drug. So that was leaked. That was not supposed to come out. It was horrifying. Like Wojciech's son told me, my father said to me, that was Black Thursday for him. Like he went into hiding because he was going to get in trouble from the commissioner of health, who was like, you cannot tell anybody about this until we give you the PR releases, right? And so until that evening, he was hiding in his office with Selikov. And his son said to me, I imagine my dad, who was like over 6 feet tall, like cowering in this corner, terrified and hearing all the buzz of the cameras and stuff. It took, Seaview closed in 1961, and I have these letters from like Hoffman LaRoche and, where they go back and forth about continuing the trials, and he's trying to get money to keep the trials going. And so it went on for years and years before they found out that this needs to be a combination therapy. And finally, in 1961, he sent the last patient home and Seaview closed. So it took 9 years before they figured out what then would become the gold standard treatment for tuberculosis. But originally, it was just one drug they were trying. Yes.
You said that the nurses were discouraged from wearing masks. Did they at one point advocate for themselves to get like what the appropriate PPE was at that time? Or because you said none of them died, right, from TB?
So from the people I interviewed, nobody knew anybody that died. There's no records at Seaview. They've destroyed all of those records, patient records and human resource records, like the files. I was able to look at those little yellow cards, which were like initial inpatient intake cards. The nurses advocated for themselves. They pick and chose their battles. They were in a good position because nobody wanted to work at Seaview. And it was the Great Depression and cases were on the rise. And they were able to push back a certain amount. They did not, from what I understand, fight over masks. They fought over placards in the dining room that said whites only. They fought over wanting to get transfers when the city said, yes, you can transfer between hospitals, because originally the Black nurses had to quit and then go and be rehired at the lowest position at the lowest salary, whereas white nurses were able to transfer between the municipal hospitals. So they picked and chose their battles. The mask thing, no, they just, from what I understand, they washed their hands and they took the best precautions they could. And, that whole story with her, she gave a talk for, I was gonna say the TB Alliance, but it wasn't the TB Alliance. It was the National Tuberculosis Association yearly meeting. And I have that talk, and she goes on and on to talk about how she saw nurses taking the mask and balling it up and putting it in their apron, and then they took it out and put it on again, and one had wiped it. And she goes on about how these nurses can't wear the mask because it makes them complacent. And the most important thing is you have to be virulent against the microbe. So no, they did not push back with the masks, from what I understand.
We do have another online question, and we have time for a couple more. What was the most surprising or moving discovery you made while researching this book?
Surprising and what?
Or moving?
There were so many of them, but I think the story that moved me the most was the story about Missouri and the Nazi. So during the war years, America was taking in German POWs, and they were putting them up in these camps that were staffed by Black nurses all around the country, paid for by American taxpayers. And Seaview would take in tuberculosis patients. They would go to a hospital called Halloran, which was like 5 miles from Seaview. That's where all the POWs would go. And the ones who had tuberculosis were sent to Seaview. And so in 1944, I think it was, or 43, this patient shows up on Missouri's ward. She works in the men's ward, and he's a Nazi, and he's a German POW, and he hates her, and he's horrible. And the men on the ward also can't stand him because he's miserable, and he makes their lives miserable, and they hate him because they would also go up on the roof and smoke with the American soldiers who would tell them these stories about the war, and these people would dream about being on the boats and on the ground with these soldiers that had come back, right? But they're locked in this hospital. And so at one point, she takes care of him for 8 months, and she incurs all of these, he's just awful to her in every way possible. And one day he turns around and he spits on her and he tells her, "I hope you die." And what struck me about that story was that for 8 months, she endures this, and nobody does anything. The administration doesn't do anything to transfer him or to put him in his place or to say anything to him. And it's just was such a story about, here was one person that was the most reviled human being in America, this POW Nazi, and he finds the one person that America considers lesser than him, the Black nurse, trying to keep him alive. And it was so moving and so poignant when I really started to think about it, like what was really happening, in this country that, like, I wasn't alive during that time, but, for these women, for these nurses, and how must she have felt having to do this job every single day. And she did it with dignity. She never said anything, just went and did her job.
Question. I'm just trying to understand, like, what was the background between that phone call from Roche to the doctor, because at that time you still had some regulations, right? Like you could not go directly from animals to human without filing like some proper paperwork and things like that.
So the way the story has been written, and Herbert Fox is not alive, so I couldn't ask him, was he had been testing INH for some years. I think he began testing it in 1949. He had read an article about vitamin B, I think it was, that helped fight tuberculosis. And I mean, this goes back to Germany with Contaban and Dr. Gerhard Domack. When they went to visit Germany, they went, two men from the Mayo Clinic went to visit Germany. And there was this rumor that there was a doctor there that was curing 7,000 tuberculosis patients during the war. And they went and they visited, and sure enough, he had this drug called Contaban, right? And because at that point, the Allies had taken over the Bayer factory and they were taking everything from inside, when he gave them the tour of these sanatoriums and then they left and he gave them Contaban. He just gave them the pill, they came back, they broke it apart, and they started to look how it was compounded, and it became what was called TB1. So they had the inner compounding of the stuff that was working, and Hoffman LaRoche took it, Herbert Fox, and I'm not an organic chemist, but from what I understand, he broke it apart, recompounded it, and came up with this drug and started testing it on guinea pigs and monkeys. And they had a working relationship with Hoffman LaRoche and the drug companies that would say, hey, you want to try this drug? Hey, you want to try, this sulfa? Most of them were sulfa-based. And they would do small trials. And so that is literally, it was like, this is working. So all those protocols didn't really start to come into place until years and years later, like what we know as clinical trials. And Robichek's papers show that. It was the dawning of what would become a clinical trial. The only thing that was out there was like they had just finished the Nuremberg trials. So there were these 10 regulations for doctors saying like, try and get consent, but there was nothing that was enforced the way we have it now. So it wasn't uncommon. I mean, that's what I know from the papers that I read, that it was literally this phone call that said, do you want to try it on humans? And it was the first, actually, Weill Cornell was testing it as well, another version of it. They were doing a smaller study. And the NTB, National Tuberculosis Association, was hoping that Weill Cornell would come up with it because it was a more prestigious hospital. That they would, it was like a race between the two of them. And that was under, oh my God, his name eluded me just now. Welsh McDermott was running that study. I wish I could give you like the real backstory about like how it all, the meetings that they had in terms of like, oh, let's call CVU Hospital right now. But it was literally the phone rang in Selikoff's office in May, and on the phone was Hoffman LaRoche and said, this was what was quoted in what the archives that I read. Hey, you know that drug we've been testing on mice and guinea pigs? It looks good. Would you like to test it on humans? And in 2 days, they said, yes, let's do it.
Great. If no other questions in the room, we probably have time for a quick last one. As one last question online. What do you hope readers take away from the book, especially those working in public health and TB research?
I hope they take away that that history is important and that it informs the present, and we're seeing that now more than ever, but, and not just tuberculosis, we were having these conversations earlier, like, you gotta know the history of polio before you say, like, we should get rid of the thing that eradicated the disease that doesn't make us live in terror every day. So I hope that they realize that history is important. That's what and that it's a great story about these really remarkable women.
Thank you so much,
You're
Maria.
welcome. Thank you.
I'll turn it over to Mel Spiegelman, our president and CEO of TV Alliance.
Yeah, oh, wow, fantastic, Maria. Thank you so much, really. I think I just want to share in the next 5 minutes or so, some random thoughts in a way of what, stimulated. By the way, Derek going totally off script, so. The first is that, thank you so much, because, for really highlighting some of the giants whose shoulders all of us still stand on and rely upon for anything that we're doing today. And it really struck me personally because when I was a medical student, Irv Selikoff was on the faculty where I was a student. He was still there in practice. He was elderly. And he was a giant of TB. I know nothing about TB, not that I know anything about TB today, but then especially, didn't know anything. And Irv was the giant and never had heard or known anything about who were really, at least fellow giants that really made a difference in the field. So that's, really thank you for highlighting all of that because it is so critically important. And the other, more personal kind of thinking about this is Seaview and all the slides you show still exist around the world. For those of us who have really had almost the privilege of either visiting the townships in South Africa or being in the favelas in Brazil or the slums of India and seeing some of the, the situation there and the TB problems there, you could go back to the 40s at Seaview and think you were, if anything, Seaview looks a little bit upscale compared to what still exists around the world in so many countries. So on the one hand, we have to be really careful not to think this is history. This is still the present real life situation in so many places around the world, albeit now, and thanks to the people in this room on the phone, on the Zoom calls with much, much better tools. And I think without going into it, with even much, much better tools to come, that we really stand on the potential of really having the necessary tools, if one can really garner the political will, because that's what it takes to a great extent, the resources, etc., to really totally bring those tools to reality and to have them really have an impact on the people who are still the millions of people who are still suffering. And on a little bit of a down note, but really what we have to have such continued vigilance and fight. One of the slides that you showed, going back probably to the 40s or whatever, one of the signs on that slide in the background said, no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. That clearly, without getting into totally the politics of today, that's a sign that may even be resurrected in the present climate, unfortunately, as we look at what's really happening in this country and in other places around the world. So the message there is that this is, if anything, the time to increase the strength of the battle, the resources, the will to actually continue this fight because it is still unfortunately very far from over. But we have seen from what you presented that victory is really possible. So Maria, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming. And let me turn it back over to Derek.
Thank you again, everybody, for participating, to Maria, to Mel, to all of you for the wonderful questions. And now, I do not look like Oprah, but I'm going to announce a bit of a giveaway. For the folks who are in the room, you might want to check underneath your chairs if there is a purple slip of paper attached to underneath your chair. You have won a copy of Maria's book. And, oh, there you go, a couple of lucky winners.
So maybe no, yes.
So great, so for the folks in the room, we can, we'll hand out the books to the winners. Maria can stick around, you can meet and greet, say hello. She's happy to sign them. For the folks who are online, thank you very much for joining. We'll also be posting, a recording of this, all of that. Yeah.
If you feel compelled to buy the book, please on Amazon, do not buy the blue version paperback. It's a pirated version that we've been playing for a year, whack-a-mole, to try and get it taken down, but it doesn't get taken down. It's an unauthorized version of the book. So while it is $10 cheaper, it's also not an authorized version. The spine is going to crack open and yeah, so just please don't buy that version of it.
There you go, counterfeit drugs, counterfeit drugs. Very inception. But yeah, and once again, thank you everybody for joining. Anybody who's online will also be posting a recording of this. So if you thought it was interesting, feel free to once it's online, feel free to tell a friend to check it out too, because it's really important that we share these stories. So thank you again for everybody who's joining. Yeah, and there's more food and all of that. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.